I'm very pleased to welcome today Dan White from Filament Games, who I've known for many years now, good friend and colleague. And I let him introduce himself.
Yeah, so as Andre said, my name's Dan White, CEO of Filament Games. We've been around for 15 years and we get up every day and we make games for positive impact. And usually that comes in the form of a game that teaches somebody something or changes a perspective or offers a new behavioral rubric. And like any game development company, we care a lot about what the player is doing and what is happening to them during the gameplay experience. And the thing that really sets us apart is that we also care a lot about what happens to them after the gameplay experience. So, how have we changed them in some hopefully positive way, whether that's a new mindset, new knowledge, new perspectives, conceptual understandings, abilities, behaviors, etc.
So, Dan, why did you choose to focus on educational games instead of entertainment games?
Well, so I'm a lifelong gamer. I've been playing games since I was as young as I can remember, and I always enjoyed them, but always also felt like it was an underutilized medium. That there was so much potential energy, and the kinetic energy, if you will, of the entertainment game side was not fulfilling the full potential of the medium. And at the same time, most of the experiences that I had growing up educationally that were really meaningful to me and that stuck with me or had a really longitudinal impact were experience based things where I got to get my hands on something and tinker with it. And so I, from a very early point in my academic career, started to form theories about what good learning looks like and how the human brain is wired to learn, and came to the conclusion that yes, everybody has different styles of learning, but there's a lot of brains out there that are underserved by the more traditional pedagogies or methodologies, and that there was there was a need for there was a need for more experience-based learning and more hands-on based learning. And games are so unique, as you know, in that they have the ability to simulate scenarios or problem spaces that would just be impractical or impossible outside of the game. And so, yeah, I just got really excited about leveraging this new technology and the service of learning in a way that up to that point it didn't seem like anybody was doing. You had it's not to say that there were no good learning games when we founded the company back in 2005, but as you looked at the landscape of learning games, you did see a lot of still kind of skill or practice or drill oriented pedagogies reflected in learning game development, and we really wanted to create that sort of those more hands-on experiences oriented toward conceptual understandings.
Now, obviously, you and Filament Games are one of the leaders in the space in game-based learning. What do you see as the biggest challenges for game-based learning?
Oh, so many, Andre. How do I pick? I mean, so I think a lot of it comes down to the culture of education and institutional education in particular. There's there's definitely an undercurrent of risk adversity. There's an undercurrent of sort of clinging to the status quo like a life raft, for fear of trying to be too pioneering and getting your hand slapped because you ruined a kid's life, or more practically speaking, they got a lower score on a test or something like that, or there's an angry parent or an angry PTA member. So there's definitely, and to a certain extent, it's fair, right? We have to be, we have with great power comes great responsibility, and
Yeah.
educators are responsible for the lives of our youth, and their academic journeys. But at the same time, if you flip that on its head, you realize that if we don't take risks, and sort of we commit to methodologies and systems and structures that have been failing many youth for as long as I've been alive and probably longer, that the inaction in and of itself is a liability. And so you almost sort of have this duty to innovate, and that doesn't necessarily have to be game-based learning. There's lots of different cool new way, not even necessarily new, but there's lots of different alternative methodologies of teaching people. Project-based learning I'm a huge fan of. I feel like project-based learning and game-based learning are kind of cousins to one another, intellectual cousins to one another. So I'm just in general, I'm a proponent of there being more a culture of willingness to innovate and experiment and take risks in school. And the fact that that unfortunately does not exist for a variety of different reasons that I'd be happy to talk more about is, I think, one of the big impediments to games being adopted.
What do you think teachers can do to actually help overcome some of these challenges?
So it's tricky because, apropos to my previous answer, teachers are in many cases subject to the system of punitive accountability, where if they take a risk and it doesn't produce the desired result, they have to answer to an administrator or a parent, or more than likely all of the above. So I sympathize with the position that a lot of educators are put in, but I would say, despite that, the biggest thing that any educator can do in order to advance game-based learning is to try it, and fail and see, and see what doesn't work, and then modify it, whether that's trying different games, or trying, putting it at different places in the curriculum, or for example, or even, don't even necessarily start by having your students play games. Having them start by designing games, for example, is another great way to use game-based learning pedagogy in order to teach something. So, I mean, there's also things like the fear that the students will sort of have greater mastery over the game than the teacher will. So, in addition to willingness to take a risk, I think there also has to be just sort of almost this like Zen release of, of fear and anxiety about what, that sort of traditional student teacher relationship, where the teacher is the master and the student is the learner, because in many cases when it comes to game-based learning, the students will outpace the teachers in terms of their ability in the game very quickly. So yeah, so I mean, I know it's easy for me to sit here as somebody who's not subject to the punitive accountability measures that educators are, and say, go take risks and abandon your fears, and try this newfangled technology. But honestly, that's the only way anything new, ever gets adopted, is somebody takes a risk.
That's a really good point. And with big risks are potentially also big rewards. If
Mm.
you look at it based on your expertise and experience, what do you think actually the biggest opportunities are in terms of game-based learning?
Yeah, well, I mean, the size of the opportunity is commensurate with the size of how dysfunctional things are across the system at the current point in time, right? So there's, you know, we we fail a lot of students in that we let them graduate from high school, or even in many cases college, without a sense of without a desire to be lifelong learners, without a sense of wonder, without inspiration to continue their learning journey of their own volition. And that is, and I mean, maybe this is a real crunchy perspective, but I really feel like that is more than above and beyond anything else by a fair margin. The purpose of education is to spark inspiration, and so I would definitely say there's games, this is at the end of the day why I come back to game-based pedagogy over and over again, is that the potential to have somebody have an experience that's unlike anything they'd ever had before, that's accessible because it's a video game, and it didn't, you need a computer or a tablet or a phone, and this piece of software, and you can be transported to another place, another time, another identity, and across the span of maybe a couple hours, you can have an experience that could literally change your life. It could inspire you to become an engineer, an astronaut, or a doctor, or whatever. And there's not many learning tools or media that you could really ascribe that same level of impact potential to. So games are definitely unique in the respect that they deliver such a such an immersive, such an engaging, and such an impactful experience that I think you have the ability to accomplish that objective of propelling the student beyond that particular learning intervention toward, in best case scenario, toward potentially a career that they hadn't otherwise considered, but in a more realistic and sort of everyday scenario, at least an interest or affinity for something that they previously didn't have.
Mm, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Now, for a teacher that's thinking of adopting games, either entertainment games off the shelf or educational games for the use in their classroom, what kind of tips do you have for them? How do I start?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and honestly, it's so I feel like at this point it's so custom to the subject area because different subject areas are served better or worse in terms of the content that's available, the learning game content that's available, which is still, 15 years after starting the company, it's amazing to me that we still have so far to go in terms of, making sure that there are some really high quality learning game experiences for all, at least the core subject areas, if not the peripheral subject areas as well. And so yeah, step one is always like find the good content. And because there's a lot of not good content out there. And actually, what? I'll back up. Step one, actually, I think, is to spend a little bit of time getting more literate. And there's a lot of different ways that you can become more literate about game-based learning. And one of them is just to become more literate about games at large. I would say like play something. Step one is probably play a game if we're starting from complete scratch. And you definitely need to play more than one because games aren't like movies. You can watch a movie and sure, like the subjects and the topics and the characters and the plots change from one movie to the next. But you've had the experience of sitting down and watching a movie from start to finish. The next movie, you're going to sit down and it's going to be another, hour and a half to 2 hours. It's going to have a story arc. It's going to have it's going to, you're going to sit there and you're going to consume a narrative. But playing different games, the diversity from one game experience to the next, even just across genres, from casual to JRPG to strategy game, there's just so much diversity of experience. And it's almost like as you go from one genre to the next, say you go from 4X to FPS, your experience from one genre to the next is almost like they're different media, right? Because the experience is so different. So that's step one is play, ideally half a dozen games and from different genres to try to understand what this medium is all about and what it is that uh, it makes it so engaging and so impactful. And then from there, step two is definitely figure out who has, what content, um, what is the library of game-based learning content look like for your subject area. And I wish this step was easier, but unfortunately this step is still really hard because there's not a lot of great places where the content has been consolidated. It still is in many respects scattered to the wind. In some cases, depending on what you teach, the amazing learning game, the sort of killer app for your subject may have been developed 8 years ago or 10 years ago and maybe really, have a thick layer of dust on it and be hard to find. So unfortunately, step two is really difficult. And then step three, I would say, is once you've identified one or more learning games that you think are of high quality, step three is to just, maybe it comes with a curriculum or lesson plans. Maybe it doesn't. Let's assume that it doesn't. So I think step three is to play through the game yourself and just rather than creating a traditional curriculum where uh, you sort of break the game down into a sum of parts and try to um, and try to sort of curricularize each individual component of the game. I would say step back and think about the conceptual understandings that you think your students will walk away from that experience with, and then ideally position that game at the front of a unit as sort of, again, sort of getting back to this idea that one of the primary functions of good learning games is to inspire people or develop interest, or preparation for future learning, as Dan Schwartz and Dylan Arena talk about in a lot of their great work. So position the game at the front of the class, get the students jazzed, and then maybe after the game, transitioned over to a curriculum where students are, based on the sort of momentum they have coming out of that game experience, potentially designing their own games about the subject area, or potentially doing a deeper dive on something in the game in order to sort of, yeah, build on this newfound affinity that they have. But no matter what, I would say the best way to leverage a game in any kind of formal context or curriculum oriented context is to really focus not so much in on the content itself, but on the I guess like the way it gets students excited about the subject area.
Excellent. Thank you. Now you just mentioned the using a game up front and then perhaps later on designing games, having the students design games or designing with the students games. What kind of tips, suggestions can you give a teacher who's never made a game, who maybe brand new to even playing games and looking at games, the spectrum that say, on how to get started designing games with
Yeah,
students?
that's a great question. So, again, step one is still to have some basic literacy about games in general, because I think so much of, so like at Filament or any game design studio, every game designer is pulling from the experiences they've had with all the games that they've played throughout their life. And there's also this syndrome called last game played, where a lot of times when game designers are designing a game, they're extremely overly heavily influenced by the last game that they played and that got its hooks into their brain and that they were really excited about. So there was a period there where I was really early on in Filament where I was really into hex-based strategy games. And so any, you give me any subject area and I'd be like, oh, we gotta figure out how to make that a hex-based strategy game.
I'm
um,
still into that, by the way.
yes, I know, they're the best. I love them. So I would say, so that, but while that's a liability for like a professional game designer, for a teacher, that would be actually a really great thing, because it would give them some experience to draw from in helping their students think about designing their own games. And then another great thing that I think teachers could do is there are like little board game creation kits that will have like, um, they'll have like some standard board game pieces, and they'll have like a board game, like a whiteboard board game that you can draw on and erase on. They'll have grids or hexes, or some of the basic tools or components for starting to think about how you would design a system around any particular subject area. And having those physical pieces, I think, in some ways can be tools for thought, and that they kind of help the educator think about the possibility space of the game, and constrict the possibility space, which is actually a good thing, I think, for when you're starting out designing a game or anything else, is to have some constraints on how you think about the problem space. So I would say that would be tip number two. And then tip number three would maybe just be to uh, start with one learning objective per game. So like whether you want to divide students into groups and have them each take on a different learning objective, or have everybody do this as an individual exercise and take on the same learning objective, but to just keep it to one learning objective at the outset, and to get the students really thinking about what the best verbs or mechanics, or maybe even verb or mechanic, just keeping it simple, would really impart to a player that one single learning objective. And then if they get comfortable doing that, then I think you can get more advanced.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, I want to give you an opportunity to, if you'd like, to talk about the games at Filament. We have, yeah, you've obviously been in the business for a long
Mhm.
time. As I mentioned, leader in the industry, worldwide. So, what games are all one? Totally up to you. Do you want to highlight and
Oh,
kind of briefly mention to our teachers or aspiring teachers that they may want to check out and use in their classrooms?
absolutely. So there's a game project that we're working on right now that I'm super fired up on, because it sort of harkens back to the very first game learning game that I ever developed, which is when I was in grad school at the University of Madison, where there were no, no client constraints, no monetary constraints. It was just dream up what you think the ideal, what an ideal learning game looks like. And at that point in my thinking, which by the way hasn't really changed that much over the last 15 years, the ideal learning game was is kind of like a sandbox space that presented the player with some really interesting problems, and then the player has to design solutions to those problems in an open-ended manner. So the first game that we did was an ocean science game where you're on an alien planet and you have to try to work to use the tools of science to try to understand how the ecosystem works. And the reason we wanted to do that is because we didn't want you to learn science as something, that somebody else had already discovered. We wanted you to use the tools of science in order to make new discoveries of your own, so you could have a sense of agency and ownership over those discoveries. And so fast forward 15 years later, across that span of time, we haven't gotten to make very many games that have been sort of open-ended sandbox discovery or design oriented. They've all tended to be a little bit more content oriented, and that's just, for practical reasons. That's what our clients tend to need. But we're now working on a game called RoboCo, which is a game that teaches robotics. So it's a digital robotics experience that philosophically kind of harkens back to some of those reasons why I was originally inspired to build the company back in 2005. And so RoboCo is a game where you have to solve some sort of, just like in traditional robotics, you have to solve a problem. Maybe you have to build a robot that can deliver a sandwich to a table, or it can cut a branch off of a tree, or shoot a basketball through a hoop. And you, through the sandbox play space, can build whatever robotic solution that you want to that problem. We're also in the process of adding programming right now, so you'll be able to program your robots in addition to the mechanical engineering component, be able to build them. And part of the reason why I'm so excited about this game is not just from the educational perspective, and how well aligned it is with some of my core philosophies about what good learning games look like, but also because robotics is extremely inaccessible to a lot of people because it's so expensive. The physical kits are amazing learning tools, but they're really, really expensive. And so we're kind of poking at this question of like, what sorts of affordances can we offer in the digital space that are comparable to what you can do in a physical space, and what sorts of things are maybe even better than what you could do in a physical space. For example, rapid prototyping, and how can we deliver all of that at a fraction of what it would cost to actually have your own physical robotics kit. Now, just to be clear, I would never advocate for, I think the physical robotics kits are amazing. I think the hands-on nature of working with a physical robotics kit is ultimately absolutely essential to somebody's sort of educational journey if they want to get into robotics. But basically we're saying, like, how can we add another tool to the belt so that robotics is more accessible to more people?
Oh, that sounds really exciting.
Yeah.
Any other games you want to mention and talk about?
Oh, well, let's see. What else have I been really? What other games have
This
I
is your space to brag.
been? No, there's so many. I mean, Andre, we've made, I think, over 240 games or something like that at this point. So
Wow.
they all kind of blur together in my head. I mean, I guess I always like giving a shout out to iCivics because um, they maybe that's a nice example on the other end of the spectrum where it is a little bit more content oriented than sandbox oriented. But iCivics does this. iCivics games do this really great job of saying, civics and civics literacy are an important part of your life as a citizen of the United States, and it can be pretty dry stuff, but it's incredibly important. So how do we, in a fun, engaging way, take this content and sort of bring it to life for you as a player, not only in a way that makes it understandable, but also that makes you like genuinely interested in what it means to be civically engaged. And I think those games have really just nailed that goal. And it's also kind of interesting because it's one of the only like complete game-based curriculum for a subject area that doesn't resort to doing kind of drill and skill core mechanics. Um, and because that's one of the fundamental tensions, as you know, between scope and complexity or like quality of the game, and that the more content that you want to cover, usually the shallower you have to go with your game mechanics.
Yeah,
And so iCivics has struck this really nice balance where they cover we it's taken a long time, but we now cover a lot of civics content, but each game is still pretty robust and deep in terms of the play space.
excellent. Well, thank you. Before we finish up, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience today?
So who's the audience?
The audience are teachers and
K-12
future teachers.
teachers. This is K-12.
K-20. So both
K-20. Okay.
K-12 and college, university faculty.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So here's what I would say. Game-based learning is um, it's inevitable. It's really just a question of what the timeline looks like. I mean, there's no way that um, 40, 50, 60 years from now, most learning isn't game based in some respect. Um, because it's just like fundamentally when you look at when you think about how people learn deep concepts, it has to be sort of experience based. It's how the human brain is designed. And the reason that I can say that with so much confidence is that um, the curriculum is going to change across the next however many decades. I mean, I can prognosticate insofar as I know it's going to change. I don't know what the exact timeline is, but the driver behind that change is going to be machine learning and automation and roboticization of the workforce, because the workforce that um, kids today are going to graduate into is going to be so starkly different and probably almost unrecognizable compared to what you and I graduated into years ago. And uh and and it, you know I think it's like, yes, it'll be your future facing skills, your 21st century skills, the things that are your higher order skills on the Bloom's taxonomy, etc. But that's going to cause a quite a stir in the education space, because those skills are really difficult to assess. They're difficult to teach and they're difficult to measure, and as such they are I think historically have been like these sort of nice to haves that have lived on the periphery of the education system. Like, we know that they're important, but they're so intangible and so ephemeral that it's been really difficult to say, like, let's work these into all of our core curriculum. I think NGSS did a really nice job of trying, but still, like, you look at a standard curriculum for any particular subject, and it still will be primarily oriented toward the content, and then the 21st century skills will kind of, in a best case scenario, come along for the ride if there's an emphasis on things like project-based learning or game-based learning, that are sort of more collaboration or sort of critical thinking or problem solving oriented. So that's I think we've been able to get away with that for a long time now, but now the writing's on the wall that if you don't have uniquely human skills when you graduate, you don't have a job. And then there's, of course, this tremendous there will be this huge requirement to re-educate a huge population of people who went through the more traditional education system and worked a job for maybe a year, maybe decades, that has gone away due to automation and machine learning, who will need to be reskilled and upskilled, right? So there's just going to be this huge number of people, both people coming into the system for the first time and people coming back into the system after being in the workforce for some period of time, who will need to be taught skills that the traditional system honestly has not been great at teaching. And that's where I think game-based learning is going to swoop in with a cape on and help save the day, because when you look at a lot of those both for teaching and for measurement and assessment, because when you look at a lot of those skills, you realize that a lot of them are the best way to both understand, excuse me, to teach them and to assess them is by providing people with experiences that um, that sort of force those skills to the surface, if you will. And that's why like robotics is a perfect example. It's like a superfood for 21st century
Right.
skills, you know. And so it's not to say that game-based learning is the only way to do that, but I think will be part of a tapestry of these more progressive curriculum or progressive pedagogies that will come to dominate across the next couple decades. So the better you can be prepared for that, I think the more fruitful your career will be.
I couldn't agree more. Well, there you have it from legendary designer Dan White. Game-based learning is inevitable.
Inevitable.
Uh, I love that. Well, thank you so much. Well, on behalf of everybody, applause. Thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it. And with that.
Absolutely. Yep. Thanks for having me.